The ticket booth at the Suzor No. 2 Theater sat on a corner of North Main Street in Memphis, Tennessee, collecting summer dust and August heat on the evening of July 8th. The woman inside the glass box, her name was Dorothy, though no one in this story would remember it, had sold tickets at this theater for 11 years. She had seen thousands of faces pass through these doors. Young couples on dates, families with children too restless to sit still, lonely men who came to the matinees to escape whatever waited for them at home. But she would remember this face. He was 19 years old, though he looked younger. Thin, with dark hair combed into a style that made him look like he was trying too hard to be something he wasn't quite sure of yet. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, nothing fancy, the clothes of a working-class kid from the government housing projects a few blocks away. But there was something about his eyes that caught her attention, a nervousness that seemed almost physical, like he was vibrating at a frequency the rest of the world couldn't hear. "One ticket, please," he said, and his voice was soft, polite, the accent of someone who had grown up in Mississippi before moving to this city. Dorothy slid the ticket across the counter. He paid with exact change and disappeared into the darkness of the theater without looking back. It was around 9:15 in the evening. Inside the theater, the boy found a seat near the back, away from the handful of other patrons scattered throughout the room. The newsreels were playing. Something about President Eisenhower. Something about the situation overseas. The kind of footage that washed over you without leaving any impression. He wasn't watching. He was staring at the screen, but his eyes weren't registering anything they saw. His name was Elvis Presley, and somewhere across town, his voice was about to come out of a radio for the first time. 3 days earlier, in a cramped recording studio at 706 Union Avenue, something extraordinary had happened, though none of the people present fully understood it at the time. Elvis had been working with 2 local musicians, a guitarist named Scotty Moore and a bass player named Bill Black, trying to record songs for Sam Phillips at Sun Records. The sessions had been frustrating. Nothing clicked. Elvis sang ballads the way every other young singer sang ballads, and Phillips was looking for something different, something he couldn't quite name but would recognize when he heard it. Then, during a break, Elvis had started fooling around with an old blues song, "That's All Right," written by Arthur Crudup, a black musician whose records Elvis had listened to on the radio stations that played after dark, the stations his white neighbors pretended not to know about. He sang it fast, loose, almost like a joke, jumping around the studio, letting his body move the way it wanted to move, not caring for once whether he looked foolish. Scotty joined in. Then Bill, and Sam Phillips stuck his head out of the control room, with a look on his face that none of them had ever seen before. "What are you doing?" he asked. Nobody knew. "Do it again," Sam said. "And this time, I'm recording." What came out of that spontaneous moment was unlike anything on American radio. It wasn't country. It wasn't blues. It wasn't the kind of polished pop that dominated the charts. It was something else entirely. A sound that existed in the space between categories, in the territory that segregation had declared off-limits. Sam Phillips took an acetate of the recording to Dewey Phillips, a disc jockey at WHBQ, who hosted a show called Red Hot and Blue. Dewey had built his reputation playing music for a mixed audience in a rigidly segregated city. Rhythm and blues, boogie-woogie, whatever sounded good, regardless of who had made it. He was brash, irreverent, and possessed an ear for music that his competitors lacked. When he heard "That's All Right," he knew immediately what he had. "I'm playing this tonight," he told Sam. And now, on the evening of July 8th, Elvis Presley sat alone in a movie theater, unable to bring himself to listen. He had told his parents to keep the radio on, tuned to WHBQ, in case Dewey decided to play the record. His mother, Gladys, had promised to listen. His father, Vernon, had nodded and said something encouraging, the kind of thing fathers said when they didn't quite understand what was happening, but wanted to be supportive anyway. But Elvis couldn't sit there with them. Couldn't bear to hear his own voice coming out of that small radio in their modest apartment at Lauderdale Courts. What if people hated it? What if Dewey played the song and the phone didn't ring and he announced that they had made a mistake, that this Elvis Presley wasn't ready, wasn't good enough, would never be anything more than a truck driver with dreams too big for someone from his circumstances. So he had come here, to the Suzor, to sit in the dark and watch whatever was on the screen, and try not to think about the fact that his entire life might be changing or ending at this very moment. The movie played on. Elvis didn't register any of it. Meanwhile, at the Chiska Hotel on South Main Street, Dewey Phillips was working himself into his usual frenzy. The WHBQ studio occupied a room on the mezzanine floor, and Dewey's style was pure controlled chaos. Records scattered across the desk, his voice racing at twice the speed of normal conversation, the energy of a man who had found his calling and attacked it with total commitment. Around 9:30, he finally got around to the acetate that Sam Phillips had brought him. "Tell you what I'm gonna do," Dewey announced into his microphone. Though his audience couldn't see, his hands were shaking slightly with anticipation. "Got a new record here. Boy from right here in Memphis. Y'all tell me what you think." He dropped the needle. "And That's All Right" began to play. What happened next became legend, though the people experiencing it had no way of knowing they were living through something that would be told and retold for the next 70 years. The phone lines at WHBQ lit up. Not one call, not 5 calls, dozens, then more. People calling to ask what they had just heard, to ask who this singer was, to beg Dewey to play the song again. Dewey played it again. The calls kept coming. He played it a third time, a fourth, a fifth, lost count eventually. Played both sides. That's All Right, and its B-side, Blue Moon of Kentucky, over and over, the way a child with a new toy cannot stop playing with it. At some point, he realized he needed to get the singer on the air. The audience wanted to know who this voice belonged to. They wanted to hear from him directly. And there was another reason, too. A reason that revealed something uncomfortable about the world they all lived in. Some callers were asking a question that Dewey couldn't answer directly. They wanted to know if Elvis was white or black. The music existed in a space that shouldn't have been possible in 1954 America. It sounded like something a black artist would make. But there was something else in it too. An energy and a phrasing that didn't fit any category the callers knew. In a city where everything was segregated. Schools, restaurants, neighborhoods, radio stations. This music refused to follow the rules. Dewey needed to get Elvis on the air. He needed the audience to hear him speak, to answer seemingly innocent questions that would reveal what the law said mattered most about a person in the Jim Crow South. He picked up the phone and called the Presley residence at Lauderdale Courts. Gladys Presley answered on the first ring. She had been listening. She had heard her son's voice come through the radio. And she had felt something shift in her chest. Pride and terror and hope and grief all mixed together in a combination that only mothers know. Her boy, her Elvis, the child she had loved with a fierce and sometimes suffocating devotion since the moment he was born. The twin who had survived when his brother Jesse Guerin had not. The son who was supposed to be special because he carried the weight of 2 lives instead of 1. "Mrs. Presley," Dewey said, "I need Elvis to come down to the station. Where is he?" "He's not here," Gladys said. "He went to the movies." "Which theater?" "The Suzor, I think." He was too nervous to listen. "Get him," Dewey said. "Get him and bring him here. Right now." Gladys hung up the phone and turned to Vernon. They looked at each other for a moment. 2 people who had spent their entire lives being poor, being overlooked, being told that people like them didn't get breaks like this. Then they grabbed their keys and headed for the car. At the Suzor, the movie was still playing. Elvis had lost track of time. He had lost track of everything except the knot in his stomach and the certainty that he was about to be exposed as a fraud, as a kid who had gotten lucky once and would never be lucky again. Then the lights came on. Not all the way. Just enough for someone to enter the theater without stumbling. Elvis looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and saw 2 figures moving down the aisle toward him. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Then he recognized them. His parents. "Elvis," Gladys said, and her voice was strange, breathless, almost trembling. "You have to come with us." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Vernon said. "Everything's right. Dewey Phillips wants you at the station. He's been playing your song." People are calling in like crazy." Elvis didn't move. He couldn't process what he was hearing. "The record," Gladys said. "They love it, baby. They love it." Still he sat there, frozen in his seat, unable to believe that the thing he had been dreading had turned into something else entirely. The other patrons in the theater were starting to look, curious about the commotion, about these people who had interrupted the movie to fetch someone like he was royalty, like he was important. "Come on," Vernon said. "We have to go." Elvis stood up. His legs felt unsteady, like they belonged to someone else. He followed his parents out of the theater, past Dorothy in the ticket booth, who would remember his face for the rest of her life without ever knowing who he was, out into the humid Memphis night, where the air smelled like exhaust and possibility. They drove to the Chiska Hotel. Elvis didn't speak during the ride. He pressed his face against the window and watched the streets go by. The city he had grown up in. The same storefronts and corners he had known since he was 13 years old. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. When they arrived at WHBQ, Dewey Phillips was waiting. "There he is," Dewey shouted, loud enough for the microphone to pick up, loud enough for all of Memphis to hear. "Get in here, boy. Sit down. We're gonna talk." Elvis sat down in the studio. He had never been on the radio before. He had never been interviewed. He had no idea what he was supposed to say or how he was supposed to say it. "Just be yourself," Dewey said. "Just answer my questions." And before Elvis could process what was happening, the interview began. Dewey asked him about his life, his interests, where he came from. Simple questions, friendly questions. But there was one question that mattered more than the others. One that Dewey slipped in casually, as though it were just another piece of small talk. "Where'd you go to high school, Elvis?" "Humes," Elvis said. "L.C. Humes High School." And in that single answer, everything the listeners needed to know was revealed. Because in Memphis, in 1954, everyone knew which schools were white and which were black. Humes was white. Elvis was white. The mystery was solved. The strange boy who sang like the music on the late-night stations, who moved like someone who had absorbed the rhythms of a culture that wasn't supposed to be his, was not what some had suspected. He was white. He was local, and he was about to become something no one had ever seen before. The interview continued. Elvis answered questions, his voice nervous but genuine. The voice of a boy who had no idea how to be anything other than exactly what he was. When it was over, Dewey told him the phones had been ringing all night, that people loved the record, that this was just the beginning. Elvis walked out of the studio in a daze. His parents were waiting in the hallway. Gladys was crying. Vernon had his hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening in the harsh fluorescent light. They looked at their son, their strange, beautiful, gifted son, and they didn't have words for what they were feeling. "I didn't even know we were on the air," Elvis said. "What?" Vernon asked. "The interview. I thought we were just talking. I didn't know the microphone was on." Years later, people would ask Elvis about that night. They would want to know what it felt like to hear yourself on the radio for the first time, to realize that the dream you had been chasing was suddenly, impossibly, coming true. He never found a satisfying way to answer. How do you describe the moment when everything changes? How do you explain the feeling of sitting in a movie theater, terrified that you're about to be humiliated, and then discovering that the humiliation never comes, that instead something wonderful is happening, something you never dared to believe was possible? Elvis went back to Lauderdale Courts that night. He lay in his bed in the small apartment where he had spent his teenage years, and he stared at the ceiling, and he tried to understand that he was the same person he had been that morning, but also somehow completely different. The phone rang, well into the night. Friends calling, neighbors calling, people who had heard the record and wanted to congratulate him, wanted to say they knew him, wanted a piece of whatever was happening. Gladys answered every call. She didn't sleep. She sat by the phone and accepted the congratulations on behalf of her son, her voice hoarse with joy and exhaustion, her heart so full she thought it might break. In the weeks that followed, everything accelerated. That's All Right became a regional hit, selling 20,000 copies in the Memphis area. Elvis, Scotty and Bill started playing live shows, small clubs and outdoor venues, where the crowds grew larger and more fervent with each performance. A booking at the Louisiana Hayride followed, then bigger shows, then bigger still. But that's not what matters. What matters is the moment before all of it. The moment when a frightened teenager sat in a dark movie theater, unable to listen to his own voice, convinced that he wasn't good enough, that people like him didn't get chances like this, that the dream he had been nurturing in secret was about to be exposed as foolish and impossible. And then his parents appeared, and they told him that the thing he feared most had become the thing he hoped for. And he walked out of that theater a different person. Dorothy, the ticket taker, never knew who he was. She never connected the nervous boy who bought a single ticket on July 8, 1954, with the phenomenon who would appear on magazine covers and television screens over the next 2 decades. To her, he was just another face in the crowd. Forgettable, unremarkable, one of thousands who passed through those doors. But she remembered him. Something about those eyes, something about the way he moved, like a person waiting for news that would either save him or destroy him. She told her husband about it that night, told him about the strange kid who seemed too wound up to watch a movie, who kept looking toward the exit like he expected someone to come for him. He looked scared, she said, really scared, but also like he was waiting for something. She never learned what he was waiting for, but she thought about him sometimes, over the years, when she was selling tickets to people whose faces she wouldn't remember, people who were just passing through on their way to somewhere else. That's what we all are, in the end. People passing through. People waiting for something without knowing what it is. Elvis Presley found out on a July night in Memphis, when the music he had made by accident turned out to be the music the world was waiting for without knowing it. It could have gone differently. He could have listened to the doubts in his head, the voices that said he wasn't good enough, that people from Lauderdale courts didn't become famous, that the wisest thing to do was to keep driving that truck for Crown Electric and stop dreaming of impossible things. But he made the record anyway. He sang the song anyway. And then he sat in the dark, too frightened to hear what the world would say. The world said yes. Not everyone, of course. There would be critics who hated him, establishment figures who dismissed him, people who saw something threatening in the way he moved and the music he made. The Grand Ole Opry would reject him 3 months later. Newspapers would write editorials about the corruption of youth. Ministers would preach sermons about the devil's music. But the kids who heard "That's All Right" on their radios that night, the teenagers who called WHBQ to beg Dewey Phillips to play it again, they understood something that the critics didn't. They understood that this wasn't just a new song. It was a new feeling, a new way of being alive, a door opening to a world where the old categories didn't apply, where a white kid could sing like the music he had heard on Beale Street and nobody could stop him. Elvis didn't know any of this as he lay in bed that first night, the phone ringing downstairs, his mother's voice murmuring answers to callers whose names he would never learn. He only knew that something had happened, something he couldn't take back, something that would carry him forward into a future so different from his past, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how the boy from the shotgun shack in Tupelo had become the man the world couldn't stop watching. It started in a movie theater. It started with fear and doubt, and the certainty that he wasn't good enough. And then his parents came through the door, and they told him the news, and he walked out into a night that would never quite end. That's the story. Not the legend, not the icon, not the cultural phenomenon, or the revolutionary moment, or any of the things that would be written about him in the decades to come. Just a scared kid in a movie theater. And the night the world found him there,